Would say all of the assets that we have got multi-cancer potential, some cancer potential, but at least multi-cancer potential. So really it's about identifying the best clinical routes that support fastest access into clinical trials and into the markets that have got the biggest unmet clinical need.
Very welcome back inside our proactive newsroom. And joining me now is Mark Eccleston. He is the CEO of ValiRX. And Mark, it's great to see you again. How are you?
I'm great, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks very much. It's been a little while since you and I had a chance to talk. There's been lots going on within the company, and we're going to get to all of it. But first, maybe for those not familiar, give me a bit of an overview of the company.
So ValiRX is a small UK listed company. We're on the AIM stock market in the UK. We basically find interesting assets, we bring them in-house under an evaluation agreement, and then we de-risk them. If we like those assets, then eventually we'll bring them in, we'll put them in a commercial vehicle. So we'll set them up in their own commercial vehicle, in a special purpose vehicle, and then we in-license the asset into that vehicle going forward. So we've got several of those running at the moment, and I guess we'll go into those in detail, but we've got Inapia, which is our core research facility where all of our R&D takes place. We've got Cytolytics, which is an oncolytic peptide program. We've got ValiRX Animal Health. I know you want to touch on that going forward. And we've got Blue Ribbon Bio, which we established recently as well.
So let's sort of start from the beginning here, and you mentioned obviously the key ones. So let's start there because that's obviously what takes the most of your time, I would imagine. So explain that part of the company to everyone.
So in terms of the individual setup, so the idea is that we build each company, each small company within its own management team, and we can leverage the resources across the group. Basically, they're designed to be complementary to each other. So, for example, with the animal health, ValiRX Animal Health, we've set that up specifically to develop clinical applications for all of our assets that basically work in animals, so in companion animals. So it could be canines, it could be cats, it could be horses, and all of our assets in principle have activity in those species. It's an independent market, so there's a market's around $3.1 billion, expected to reach that by about 2030. So it's a substantial market. That's the same size, for example, as our triple negative breast cancer market. But it's also a smart way to develop drugs because you can develop much faster clinical data in companion animals. The restrictions to get to the clinic are lower. There's a less regulatory burden. There's still regulations that you have to follow, but it's a parallel stream to humans. So we can get into companion animals, develop drugs for animals in animals way faster than you would necessarily get the clinical human data. But the data in the animal bit will then support the human programs going forward. So it's real world clinical data rather than using contrived animal models, rather than using research models. We're using real patients and developing data that benefits those patients and also for the humans as well.
And one of those is an asset from McGill University, right?
Yeah, so we've got a really interesting asset that we've been evaluating from McGill University. We've been talking to those guys now since January. We brought that in under evaluation. I would say it's probably the best asset that we've ever had in-house to evaluate. The target indication for that, we're thinking about osteosarcoma, so bone cancer. Why bone cancer? Well, bone cancer is identical in dogs as it is in humans. But in humans, it affects predominantly children, so it's a pediatric oncology. It's got an orphan disease status, which means it only affects a very small number of individuals. So there's a real unmet clinical need, but it's a niche market. There are advantages on the human side to address that because it means you get preferential market access, you get longer protection within the market outside of any patent protection, but also you get a slightly less difficult, I won't say easier, a less difficult clinical trial process. So it's a shortened clinical trial process. But then if you go onto the canine side, similarly, it's an identical disease. As I said, there's a principle, it's called comparative oncology, where you develop data in pet patients, and then you can use that to inform the human side. But the prevalence of osteosarcoma in dogs is 30 times higher than it is in humans. So there's way more patients to basically do your evaluation on. And then that's, in part is what generates that substantial market going forward.
Let's talk about women's cancers because I know you deal with that. There's also colorectal cancer as well. You're in a lot of different areas, so kind of break those down for us.
So most of the assets that we bring in-house, in fact, I would say all of the assets that we have got multi-cancer potential, some cancer potential, but at least multi-cancer potential. So really it's about identifying the best clinical routes that support fastest access into clinical trials and into the markets that've got the biggest unmet clinical need. So, for example, with cytolytics, which is our oncolytic peptide program, that is focusing in triple negative breast cancer. It's a very hard to treat unmet clinical need. Uh, and similarly to our other peptide program, which is 201, which we put now into Blue Ribbon Bio. So the idea is to have a parallel pathway for prostate cancer, which is clearly not focused in women's health, but there are applications of that program in endometriosis and also in breast cancer. So yeah, so we've got a focus. It's the same peptide, it's the same mechanism of action, it's the same kind of work that you need to do to get it through those stages towards the clinic. So providing the data that you generate is supports entry into the clinic in men and in women. So that's something to remember, that if you go into a clinical trial, largely those clinical trials up to now have been dominated by men in terms of access, but you need to make sure that you get your clinical data in women and in men, and then you can take them forward into multiple indications.
Is that why it's important to sort of break these up into companies so you can have these teams focusing on what they're working on? Because if what you've talked about is a lot of things, and if it's one group that's trying to do it all, it obviously can cause a problem. It sounds like you have really narrowed it down to a really smart way of trying to move these forward.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot, and a lot of it overlaps,
Yeah,
but for
sure.
sure it's a lot of work. But it does allow you then to focus. So particularly if you're talking to a potential collaborator, or if you're at a partnering meeting, then you can present one single company and the assets around that, show how that fits in within the broader the broader pipeline. So the idea then as well is that each of those assets is independently investable. So we'll, as I mentioned at the start, we're listed on AIM, so we've raised some money recently to support the evaluation phase and taking some of those assets as far as we can. It'll take more money to take them back towards the clinic though, so the intention is to raise that money within those companies. So effectively what we're doing there is we're diluting the assets rather than diluting the overall company. So it means
Yeah.
that our core shareholders are protected from the dilution. We can bring in new assets. I could go out and license 10 new assets tomorrow. Honestly, there's no shortage of good assets. And we're getting really much smarter, I would say, now at the way that we evaluate those assets, the way that we select them, and the way that we bring them in. So going back to the McGill asset, we signed that evaluation agreement in January, and we're very close to being able to make a decision on that. I mean, it's as I said, the work that we did up front, picking a better asset with more data, a better quality asset, means that we can turn these around much more quickly. And then we can find additional partners. They could be charitable funders, they could be grant soft funding, for example, or it could be from additional private investors, so venture capital or angel groups, for example. We've been talking to some angel groups around the animal health sector, for example, who would be particularly focused in that specialist area, and that wouldn't necessarily want to invest in, the whole company and the whole portfolio of assets.
Sure, makes sense. Okay, so let's wrap it up here. Let's talk a little bit about what's ahead. Give me some thoughts in the next 3 to 6 months, some of the things that people should be aware of.
So the key things that we've got coming out in the next 3 months are going to be a decision on the on an in license and a new SPV to focus our next kind of commercial wrap and asset that we're bringing in. We've got readouts now on some new patents that we filed, and also a grant of a patent around the cytolytics asset that we've got. So that's been announced. And we've got a whole bunch of soft funding. So there's between July and the end of the year, we've got several big grants that that we're waiting on readouts for. These are high risk. We know that, and I guess most people know that the chances are relatively low. But these could be transformational for us. So we got some six-figure grants and we got some seven-figure grants coming in. So European funding, big programs funding, things that would really transform the company going forward.
All right, we'll look forward to keeping an eye on all of that. Mark, thanks so much. Really great to see you as always, and congratulations on so far. And we look forward to following your story. Okay,
Thanks, Steve.
good to see you again, Dr. Mark Eccleston, the CEO of ValiRX.